The resonance of the hull was a low-frequency vibration that lived in the marrow of Kalen's bones, a constant reminder of the thin membrane of carbon silicate weave separating life from the absolute zero of the void. This was not the smooth, hummed symphony of the inner rim cruisers, but the jagged, uneven rattling of a long-haul extractor ship, the Vespa 9, as it clawed through the gravitational well of a dying gas giant. Kalen adjusted the pressure seal on his forearm, feeling the pneumatic hiss of the suit tightening against his skin. The air inside the cockpit smelled of recycled oxygen and the metallic tang of ionizing radiation, a scent that had become more familiar to him than the blooming gardens of his youth on the terrestrial colonies. He looked at the sensor array, which flickered with a rhythmic instability. The data streams were a chaotic tangle of gold and violet light, indicating a massive density of exotic matter ahead, a pocket of unrefined kinetic ore that could power a district for a decade or vaporize a ship in a millisecond. The mission parameters were clear, yet the reality of the extraction was always more fluid than the briefings suggested. Navigation was a matter of intuition as much as mathematics in these volatile sectors. Kalen's hands moved across the haptic interface with a practiced grace, his fingers dancing through holographic projections that represented the ship's structural integrity and the surrounding gravitational shear. To his left, his second-in-command, Vaxon, was buried in a terminal, monitoring the thermal dissipation of the main engines. Vaxon was a man of few words, his face a map of scars earned in the deep-crust mines of the moons, and his presence provided a grounding weight to the tension in the cabin. They were drifting toward the event horizon of a localized spatial rupture, a phenomenon the Guild referred to as a glint, where the laws of physics seemed to fray at the edges, allowing rare elements to bleed through from a higher dimension. As the Vespa 9 edged closer to the swirling vortex of the glint, the visual distortion became overwhelming. The stars behind them stretched into elongated needles of light, while the space ahead grew dark and thick, like ink poured into water. Kalen felt the ship groan, the sound echoing through the bulkheads as the tide of gravity began to pull at the frame. He shifted the power distribution to the forward shields, knowing that the primary danger wasn't just the gravity, but the debris caught in the spin. Microasteroids, accelerated to relativistic speeds, hammered against the outer, plating with the sound of distant gunfire. Every impact sent a shudder through the deck plates, making the lighting flicker and the emergency alarms chirp in short, panicked bursts. He had to keep the ship centered in the eye of the storm, a task that required constant, minute adjustments to the thrusters. The extraction arm, a massive mechanical limb tipped with a focused graviton drill, began to deploy from the ship's belly. It was a masterpiece of engineering, capable of anchoring itself to the fabric of spacetime long enough to pull solid matter from the swirling chaos of the glint. Kalen watched the monitor as the drill head began to glow, its internal reactors reaching the critical temperature needed to pierce the dimensional barrier. This was the moment of highest risk. If the drill hit a pocket of unstable energy, the resulting feedback loop would travel up the arm and detonate the ship's core before they could even initiate an emergency disconnect. He held his breath, his eyes fixed on the pressure gauges. The needle climbed steadily, crossing into the red zone as the drill made contact with the shimmering core of the kinetic deposit. Suddenly, a massive surge of energy rippled through the ship. The haptic interface burned Kalen's fingertips, and he pulled back with a sharp intake of breath. The Vespa 9 lurched violently to the starboard side, throwing Vaxon against his console. The gravity stabilizers failed for a fraction of a second, leaving them momentarily weightless, before the backup systems slammed them back into their seats with a crushing force. Red lights bathed the cockpit in a bloody hue, and the voice of the central computer began to recite a litany of structural failures in a calm, detached tone that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the moment. They were being pulled in. The glint was no longer just a source of awe. It had become a predatory maw, its gravitational pull increasing exponentially as it fed on the energy of their drill. Kalen fought for control, his muscles straining against the centrifugal force. He bypassed the safety protocols, rerouting all available power, including life support and interior lighting, to the aft thrusters. The ship screamed in protest, the engines pushing far beyond their rated capacity. He could feel the heat rising through the floorboards, the smell of burning insulation filling the small cabin. Vaxon was shouting something, but the roar of the engines and the screeching of the hull made it impossible to hear. Kalen focused entirely on the vector display, looking for a path of least resistance through the swirling debris. He saw a gap, a momentary thinning of the gravitational field, and he threw the ship into a desperate corkscrew maneuver. The transition was violent. One moment they were being crushed by the weight of 1,000 suns, and the next, they were catapulted into the stillness of the outer void. The sudden lack of acceleration made Kalen's head spin, and he slumped forward in his harness, gasping for air. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. He looked out the viewport to see the glint collapsing behind them, its light fading into a dull, angry purple before vanishing entirely. They had survived, but the cost was visible on every diagnostic screen. The Vespa 9 was a wreck, its outer hull scarred and pitted, its engines sputtering on the last remnants of their fuel cells. They were drifting in the deep dark, far from the established trade routes, with a hold full of the most valuable substance in the known galaxy and a ship that was barely holding together. Vaxon groaned and pushed himself upright, wiping blood from a gash on his forehead. He looked at the main display and then at Kalen, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. They hadn't spoken yet, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins, making their hands tremble. Kalen checked the cargo sensors. The kinetic ore was stable, locked in its containment field, glowing with a soft, pulsing light that seemed to resonate with the ship's own failing heartbeat. They had enough ore to buy their way onto a luxury station for the rest of their lives, provided they could find a way to get home. But as Kalen scanned the long-range sensors, he realized that their escape had not gone unnoticed. A series of blips appeared on the edge of the radar, unidentified vessels, moving with a speed and precision that suggested they were not scavengers, but something far more organized and dangerous. The realization that they were being hunted settled over Kalen like a cold shroud. He knew the stories of the Void Striders, those who lived in the cracks of the galaxy and preyed on the desperate. If those ships were indeed pursuing them, the Vespa 9 in its current state stood no chance. He turned to Vaxon, who was already working on the communications array, trying to find a frequency that wasn't jammed by the residual interference of the glint. They needed a plan, and they needed it before the hunters closed the gap. Kalen looked back at the glowing ore in the hold. It was a miracle and a curse, a catalyst for progress and a magnet for violence. He began to plot a course toward the nearest nebula, hoping the thick clouds of ionized gas would hide their heat signature long enough to make repairs. The journey into the nebula was a slow, agonizing crawl. Every time Kalen fired the thrusters, the ship groaned in a way that made him flinch. He spent hours in the maintenance crawl spaces, bypassing fused relays and patching leaking coolant lines with whatever scrap material he could find. The work was grueling and claustrophobic, the air growing thinner as the scrubbers struggled to keep up. In the quiet moments, he thought about the civilization they had left behind, the gleaming spires of the capital world, and the millions of people who relied on the very energy he was currently risking his life to transport. He wondered if they ever thought about the men and women in the dark, the ones who bled so that the lights stayed on. Vaxon joined him in the engine room, his hands covered in grease and his eyes bloodshot. They worked in a rhythmic silence, a partnership forged through years of shared danger. They managed to restore partial power to the jump drive, though it was a patchwork fix at best. One wrong calculation, and the jump would tear the ship apart, or worse, leave them stranded in the interdimensional space between stars. But they didn't have a choice. The pursuit craft were gaining, their signatures growing brighter and more distinct on the sensors. Kalen could see them now on the visual feed, sleek, obsidian-colored hulls that seemed to swallow the light around them. They were built for speed and lethality, and they were closing in with predatory intent. As they reached the edge of the nebula, the gas clouds began to glow with the reflected light of the pursuing ship's weapons fire. The hunters were testing the range, sending pulses of thermal energy that boiled the gas around the Vespa 9. Kalen scrambled back to the cockpit, his heart hammering against his ribs. He strapped himself in and began the final sequence for the jump. The ship's computer wailed in protest, listing 100 reasons why the maneuver was suicidal. He ignored them all, focusing only on the countdown. Beside him, Vaxon gripped the arms of his chair, his jaw set in a grim line. "Hold on," Kalen whispered, though the sound was lost in the rising whine of the jump drive. The space around the ship began to warp and stretch, the nebula blurring into a smear of iridescent color. The Vespa 9 shuddered violently, the sound of tearing metal echoing through the cabin. For a moment, Kalen felt as though his very atoms were being pulled apart, a sensation of infinite expansion and terrifying vertigo. Then, with a final bone-shaking jolt, the universe snapped back into focus. They were somewhere else. The nebula was gone, replaced by a field of ancient, shattered moons orbiting a cold, white dwarf star. The pursuing ships were nowhere to be seen, but the Vespa 9 was finally spent. The engines died with a long, mournful sigh, and the lights faded to a dim, emergency red. They were safe for the moment, but they were deeper in the unknown than they had ever been before. The white dwarf cast a sterile, achromatic light across the bridge of the ship, turning the controls into a landscape of stark contrasts and long, sharp shadows. Kalen watched the telemetry of the local system stabilize, realizing they had transitioned into a graveyard of planetary husks. These shattered moons were the remnants of a celestial collision that had occurred eons ago, leaving behind a dense belt of silicon and iron that now drifted in a slow, rhythmic dance around the dying star. The Vespa 9 drifted with them, its momentum spent, acting as just another piece of debris in the celestial debris field. Vaxon remained motionless for a long time, his breathing heavy and ragged, before he finally unbuckled his harness and stood up. The lack of artificial gravity meant he had to move with a calculated weightlessness, pulling himself along the guide rails toward the secondary life support systems. The ship was silent now, save for the occasional metallic ping of the hull cooling in the shadow of the moons. Kalen turned his attention to the cargo bay monitors, relieved to see the kinetic ore still pulsed with its steady, internal light. It was the only thing on the ship that seemed to possess any vitality. The containment field was holding, though the power draw was significant. If they didn't find a way to restore the primary reactors soon, the field would collapse, and the ore would react with the ship's internal atmosphere, likely causing a molecular cascade that would dissolve the hull from the inside out. He checked the fuel reserves and found they were at less than 3%. There was no chance of another jump, and even local thruster use was a luxury they could ill afford. They were effectively marooned in a system that didn't appear on any of their navigational charts, surrounded by the ghosts of dead worlds. Vaxon returned from the aft section with a handheld scanner and a grim expression. He reported that the main coolant line had sustained a hairline fracture during the jump, and they were losing liquid nitrogen at a rate that would leave the core unprotected within 6 hours. To fix it, they would need to perform an external hull walk, a prospect that was daunting given the structural instability of the ship's outer skin. Kalen looked at his hands, which were still shaking from the adrenaline. He was the pilot, but in a crew of two, everyone was a mechanic. He knew that if they stayed idle, they would freeze or suffocate long before anyone found them. He signaled for Vaxon to prep the EVA suits while he attempted to calibrate the long-range sensor dish to see if there were any signals emanating from the moons. As the sensor swept the desolate horizon, a faint, rhythmic pulse registered on the subspace frequency. It wasn't a distress beacon or a standard communication signal. It was a low-frequency resonance, almost like a mechanical heartbeat, coming from the largest of the shattered moons. Kalen narrowed the sweep, his pulse quickening. The signature was too structured to be natural. It suggested the presence of an automated facility or perhaps a derelict outpost from the era of the first expansion. If there was a facility, there might be fuel or spare parts, or at the very least, a more stable environment than their dying ship. He shared the data with Vaxon, who looked at the readout with a skeptical eye but nodded. Any lead was better than waiting for the oxygen to run out in the dark. They began the arduous process of donning the heavy external suits. Each layer was a chore, the thick fabric and reinforced plating making every movement a struggle. Kalen felt the familiar weight of the helmet as it locked into place, the internal HUD flickering to life with a list of vitals and atmospheric readings. They exited through the small airlock on the port side, stepping out into the vast, indifferent expanse of the void. The Vespa 9 looked pathetic from the outside, scorched, dented, and trailing a thin, crystalline mist of leaking coolant. They moved along the hull with magnetic boots, the clunk of each step vibrating through their suits. The repair to the coolant line was a delicate operation, requiring Kalen to weld a patch while Vaxon held the pressurized seal in place against the escaping gas. The vacuum was a sensory vacuum as much as a physical one, the only sound being the hiss of Kalen's own breath and the occasional crackle of the radio. As he worked, he couldn't help but look up at the white dwarf. It was a terrifyingly beautiful sight, a tiny needle of intense light that seemed to pierce the darkness. He thought about the hunters who had chased them into the nebula. Had they followed, or had the jump been so erratic that even their sophisticated tracking systems couldn't trace the trajectory? He hoped for the latter, but a part of him felt that the kinetic ore was a beacon they couldn't truly hide. It had a signature that transcended physical space, a resonance that the greedy could feel across the light years. The patch held. They watched the pressure gauge on the external valve stabilize, the leak finally plugged. It was a temporary victory, but it bought them the time they needed to investigate the signal on the moon. They returned to the bridge, exhausted and drenched in sweat despite the suit's cooling systems. Kalen used the last of the maneuvering thrusters to nudge the ship into a decaying orbit around the moon, a precarious maneuver that required him to calculate the gravitational pull of the white dwarf against the moon's irregular mass. As they drew closer, the moon's surface became clearer, a jagged landscape of obsidian glass and deep, shadow-filled craters. Nestled within a narrow canyon near the equator, they saw it, a structure of gleaming silver alloy that looked entirely untouched by the passage of time. It was a spire, rising hundreds of meters into the air, surrounded by a series of concentric rings that rotated slowly, powered by some unseen force. The design was unlike anything in the modern fleet. It was elegant, geometric, and ancient. Kalen felt a shiver of awe that had nothing to do with the cold. This was a remnant of the precursors, the legendary architects who had seeded the galaxy with life and technology before vanishing into the great beyond. To find an intact precursor site was the dream of every explorer and the obsession of every government. The value of the kinetic ore in their hold was nothing compared to the secrets that might be housed within that silver spire. They brought the Vespa 9 down in a flat basin a few kilometers from the spire. The landing was rough, the ship's landing struts groaning under the weight of the uneven terrain, but they remained upright. Kalen and Vaxon prepared to disembark again, this time carrying portable power cells and a basic toolkit. They didn't know if the atmosphere on the moon was breathable. The sensors indicated a thin layer of argon and nitrogen, but they kept their helmets on regardless. The walk toward the spire was surreal. The ground was composed of fine, metallic dust that puffed up in clouds around their feet, settling slowly in the low gravity. The silence here was different from the silence of the ship. It felt heavy, expectant, as if the moon itself were holding its breath. As they approached the base of the spire, the rotating rings slowed to a halt. A massive doorway, previously invisible against the smooth silver surface, slid open with a soundless grace. Kalen hesitated, his hand hovering over the sidearm at his hip. There was no sign of life, no automated defenses, just the open door inviting them into the darkness. Vaxon gestured forward, his curiosity finally outweighing his caution. They stepped inside, their shoulder-mounted lamps cutting through the gloom. The interior of the spire was a labyrinth of glowing conduits and floating translucent panels. The air here was pressurized and warm, smelling of ozone and something sweet, like crushed jasmine. They followed the primary conduit toward the center of the structure, where they found a massive chamber filled with rows of humming machines. In the center of the room sat a pedestal, and hovering above it was a sphere of pure, liquid light. Kalen approached it cautiously, his sensors going haywire. The sphere was emitting the same frequency they had picked up from orbit, but up close it was overwhelming. It wasn't just energy, it was information. He reached out a gloved hand, and as he grew closer, the sphere began to change shape, forming a complex lattice of geometric patterns that mirrored the structure of the kinetic ore in their ship. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the chamber. It wasn't a sound heard through the ears, but a thought planted directly into their minds. It was ancient, weary, and strangely compassionate. The voice spoke of a great cycle, of the rise and fall of civilizations, and of the role that the kinetic lattice played in maintaining the balance of the universe. It explained that the ore they carried was not just fuel, but a key, a fragment of a larger mechanism designed to regulate the flow of energy between dimensions. The spire was a guardian station, one of many scattered across the void, meant to ensure that the lattice did not fall into the hands of those who would use it to unravel the fabric of reality. Kalen felt a wave of vertigo as the scale of their situation became clear. They weren't just miners who had gotten lucky. They were now part of something far more significant than a simple cargo run. The voice told them that the hunters who pursued them were the vanguard of a faction that sought to weaponize the lattice, to use its power to collapse the boundaries between worlds and establish a new, dark order. The Vesper 9 had been chosen, not by chance, but by the resonance of Kalen's own intent. The spire offered them a choice. They could leave the ore here and be granted the resources to return home, or they could accept the burden of the lattice and become its protectors, moving through the shadows to keep the balance. Vaxon looked at Kalen, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and wonder. The choice was theirs to make, but the weight of it was staggering. If they stayed, they would be hunted for the rest of their lives. If they left, they would be safe, but the galaxy would be one step closer to a darkness they couldn't imagine. Kalen looked at the sphere of light, feeling its warmth through his suit. He thought about the world he knew, the people who lived in ignorance of the forces that governed their existence. He realized that he couldn't just walk away. The kinetic ore wasn't just a paycheck, it was a responsibility. He nodded to the sphere, and the chamber erupted in a brilliant, golden light that seemed to swallow them whole. The golden radiance that had filled the chamber did not dissipate so much as it settled into the very grain of their being. When Kalen's vision finally cleared, the silver spire felt different. It was no longer an alien relic of a forgotten age, but a functional extension of the ship he had left behind. The interface of his suit had been rewritten, the HUD now displaying a complex overlay of multidimensional Lie lines that crisscrossed the sector. He looked at Vaxon and saw the same transformation reflected in the man's posture. They were no longer merely crewmen of a battered extractor. They had been bonded to the lattice. The sphere of liquid light had retreated into a dormant state, but the air in the chamber remained charged with a static tension that made the fine hairs on Kalen's neck stand up. He realized then that the spire had granted them more than just knowledge. It had integrated the Vesper 9 into its own defensive network, providing the ship with a source of power that defied the conventional laws of thermodynamics. They moved back through the labyrinthine corridors of the spire with a newfound purpose, their footsteps echoing with a rhythmic precision. Upon exiting the structure, Kalen looked up at the white dwarf and saw it not as a distant, dying star, but as a focal point of gravitational energy that they could now manipulate. The Vesper 9 sat in the basin, but it had changed. The scorch marks on the hull were gone, replaced by a shimmering, iridescent film that seemed to ripple like oil on water. The landing struts had reinforced themselves with a crystalline lattice that anchored the ship firmly to the moon's surface. As they approached the airlock, the door slid open before they could even trigger the manual override. The interior of the ship was bathed in a soft, amber glow, and the smell of ozone had been replaced by a crisp, alpine freshness. Vaxon went straight to the engine room, his hands moving over the new controls with a fluency that suggested the information was being fed directly into his motor cortex. He reported that the primary reactors were now operating at a level of efficiency that was theoretically impossible. The kinetic ore in the hold was no longer a volatile hazard. It had become the heart of the ship, pulsing in sync with the white dwarf above. Kalen took his place at the helm, feeling the haptic interface merge with his nervous system. He could feel the ship's structural integrity as if it were his own skin, every sensor array an extension of his own senses. He looked at the long-range scanners and saw that the hunters had arrived in the system. They were currently decelerating near the outer gas giants, their signatures flared with the heat of their pursuit. There were 5 of them now, sleek and predatory, moving in a tight chevron formation. Kalen knew they were scanning for the Vesper 9, but the new shielding on his ship made them practically invisible to standard sensors. They were ghosts in the machine, hidden within the gravitational noise of the moon's shadow. However, he also knew that the hunters would eventually find the spire. The ancient structure was too significant to remain hidden once the sector was under such intense scrutiny. He had to lead them away, to draw them into a confrontation where the unique properties of the kinetic lattice could be used to their advantage. He engaged the thrusters, and the ship rose from the moon's surface with a silent, effortless grace, leaving no heat trail and no wake in the dust. The strategy Kalen formulated was one of calculated deception. He steered the Vesper 9 into the densest part of the debris field surrounding the white dwarf, using the irregular gravitational fluctuations of the shattered moons to mask their movement. He began to broadcast a faint, intermittent distress signal, a mimicry of their previous failing state, designed to lure the lead hunter ship into a narrow corridor between 2 massive silicon fragments. Vaxon monitored the enemy's reaction, noting how the chevron formation broke apart as the lead vessel accelerated toward the perceived weakness. The hunters were arrogant, fueled by the certainty of their superior technology and the desperation of their mission. They didn't expect the prey to have evolved. As the first hunter ship entered the kill zone, Kalen triggered the kinetic pulse. It wasn't a blast of energy in the traditional sense, but a localized manipulation of the gravitational constant. The space around the hunter ship suddenly thickened, its own momentum turned against it as the kinetic energy of its engines was reflected back into its hull. The obsidian ship crumpled like parchment, its structural beams snapping under a force they were never designed to withstand. There was no explosion, only a silent, violent implosion that left nothing behind but a cloud of fine metallic dust. The other 4 ships immediately pulled back, their sensors likely screaming with alerts they couldn't comprehend. They had lost their leader to a phenomenon they couldn't see or measure. Kalen didn't wait for them to regroup. He pushed the Vespa 9 forward, weaving through the debris with a speed that would have pulverized a standard vessel. He was no longer just flying, he was dancing with the fabric of space itself. He targeted the second ship, using the lattice to create a momentary rift in front of its flight path. The hunter ship slammed into the spatial distortion and vanished, reappearing seconds later several thousand kilometers away. Its electronics fried and its crew likely incapacitated by the sheer physiological shock of the transition. The remaining three ships began to fire blindly, their thermal beams carving long, glowing furrows through the asteroids, but Kalen was always somewhere else, a shadow moving between the heartbeats of the universe. Vaxon's voice came over the internal comms, steady and focused. He was managing the energy flow of the lattice, ensuring that the ship's core didn't overheat from the rapid-fire manipulations. He suggested that they shouldn't destroy the remaining ships if they could help it. The goal was to send a message back to their masters, a warning that the lattice was no longer an unguarded prize. Kalen agreed. He maneuvered the Vespa 9 so that it sat directly in the path of the three hunters, decloaking the ship and allowing its iridescent hull to burn brightly against the dark. For a moment, there was a tense standoff, the hunters hovering in uncertainty as they stared at the ship that should have been their victim. Then, Kalen initiated a wide-frequency broadcast. He didn't use words, but instead sent a compressed burst of the information he had received in the spire, the history of the Great Cycle, the weight of the responsibility they now carried, and the inevitable cost of attempting to subvert the lattice. The data was a psychic hammer, a weight of truth that bypassed their linguistic centers and struck at their core instincts. He watched as the three ships wavered, their engine glows dimming as if they were losing the will to fight. One by one, they turned away, banking into the dark and engaging their jump drives to retreat to whatever dark corner of the galaxy they had crawled out from. They were not defeated in body, but their purpose had been shattered. Kalen leaned back in his seat, the amber glow of the cockpit feeling like a warm embrace. The immediate threat was gone, but the weight of the future felt heavier than ever. They were now the stewards of a power that could reshape the stars, and they were alone in the vastness of the void. He looked at the navigation console, which was now filled with coordinates to other Guardian stations, other spires hidden on the edges of the known universe. Their journey was just beginning. They wouldn't be going home to the terrestrial colonies, at least not for a very long time. They had a cycle to maintain and a lattice to protect. Vaxon walked up to the bridge and placed a hand on Kalen's shoulder. They didn't need to speak. The resonance between them was enough. The Vespa 9 turned away from the white dwarf and its graveyard of moons, pointing its nose toward the distant, shimmering clouds of the galactic core. With a thought, Kalen engaged the jump drive. This time, there was no sound of tearing metal, no sensation of vertigo. The ship simply slipped through the folds of reality, a needle threading the tapestry of existence, moving toward the next node in the great kinetic lattice. Behind them, the spire on the moon began to rotate again, its silver rings spinning in a slow, eternal vigil, waiting for the next time the balance would be threatened and the Guardians would be called to act. The transition through the lattice gate was unlike any jump Kalen had experienced in his decade of deep space navigation. Instead of the violent compression of a standard warp drive, the Vespa 9 seemed to dissolve into a stream of pure mathematics, a sequence of logical steps that bypassed the physical distance between stars. They emerged in a sector that was not on any colonial map, a region where the stellar density was so high that the sky was a solid curtain of pale gold. Here, three suns revolved around a common center of mass, their gravitational interplay creating a complex web of radiation that would have stripped the hull of any ordinary craft. The ship's new hull responded by shifting its hue to a deep, absorbent violet, soaking up the excess energy and feeding it into the secondary storage banks. Kalen felt a strange sense of equilibrium, a feeling that they were no longer intruding upon the void, but were finally a part of its internal architecture. Vaxon was already analyzing the local topography, his fingers moving through holographic streams of data that looked more like organic vines than digital code. He pointed to a massive structure drifting in the Lagrange point between the two largest stars, a station that looked less like a construction and more like a frozen explosion of obsidian and glass. It was jagged, asymmetrical, and ancient, spanning several kilometers in length. This was the second node indicated by the Spire's map, a repository of the Kinetic Lattice known in the MindLink as the Synapse. Unlike the Guardian Spire, which had been a passive observer, the Synapse felt active, its consciousness brushing against Kalen's mind with a sharp, inquisitive edge. It demanded verification, a proof of intent that went beyond mere physical presence. As they drew closer to the Synapse, Kalen noticed a series of smaller vessels tethered to its outer protrusions. They weren't the sleek, obsidian ships of the hunters, but archaic, patchwork craft that seemed to have been built from the salvaged remains of a dozen different civilizations. These were the scavengers of the deep periphery, a nomadic culture that lived on the crumbs of the precursors. They had likely been here for generations, trying to crack the secrets of the Synapse with crude thermal drills and plasma cutters. Kalen felt a pang of concern. The scavengers were a desperate lot, driven by the hunger for technology they couldn't possibly understand, and their presence here was like a swarm of insects crawling over a sleeping god. If they accidentally triggered the station's defensive protocols, the resulting energy discharge would cleanse the entire system of life. The Vespa 9 approached the docking umbilical of the Synapse, its presence immediately drawing the attention of the scavenger fleet. A dozen small, maneuverable interceptors detached from the main hub, buzzing around Kalen's ship like angry hornets. They began to transmit a cacophony of distorted audio and visual signals, a mixture of threats, pleas for trade, and religious iconography. Kalen ignored the transmissions, focusing instead on the handshake protocol being established between his ship and the station. The lattice within the Vespa 9 was communicating with the station's core, exchanging vast quantities of encrypted data in a matter of nanoseconds. The scavengers, sensing that something significant was happening, began to fire their low-yield kinetic cannons, the slugs bouncing harmlessly off the Vespa 9's shimmering violet shield. "They're going to get themselves killed," Vaxon muttered, his eyes fixed on the power readings. He wasn't talking about the scavengers' weapons fire, but the station's reaction to the localized aggression. The Synapse was beginning to wake up, its internal radiators glowing with a dull, cherry-red light. The rotation of its various segments accelerated, creating a gravitational shear that began to pull the scavenger ships toward the obsidian hull. Kalen knew he had to act quickly. He used the lattice to project a localized dampening field around the scavenger fleet, neutralizing their engines and locking their ships in place. It was a gesture of mercy, a way to keep them from being crushed by the station's awakening, but the scavengers interpreted it as an act of hostility. A large, bulbous freighter, the flagship of the scavenger fleet, began to charge its primary mining laser. It was a massive, inefficient weapon, but at this range, the sheer thermal output could cause significant stress to the Vespa 9's shields. Kalen didn't want to destroy them. He saw them as victims of their own ignorance. He opened a wideband transmission, projecting a simplified version of the lattice consciousness into their bridge systems. He showed them the scale of what they were dealing with, the true nature of the Synapse as a regulator of galactic stability rather than a treasure chest to be looted. For a moment, the mining laser flickered and died. The scavenger fleet fell silent, the weight of the revelation momentarily paralyzing their resolve. In that window of silence, the Synapse opened. A massive aperture in the central obsidian spire spiraled outward, revealing a docking bay illuminated by the same liquid light they had seen in the Guardian's spire. Kalen guided the Vespa 9 inside, the ship systems syncing perfectly with the station's internal guidance. As they crossed the threshold, the atmosphere changed. It was dense and heavy, saturated with a high concentration of noble gases that made the very air shimmer with a faint luminescence. The scavenger ships were left outside, still held in the dampening field, a silent audience to the transition of the Guardians. Once inside, the aperture closed, sealing them into a world of crystalline silence and ancient machinery. Kalen and Vaxon disembarked, their boots clicking against a floor made of transparent diamond. Beneath their feet, they could see the inner workings of the station, layers of gears and conduits that stretched down into the dark heart of the structure. In the center of the bay stood a figure, or what appeared to be a figure. It was a construct of floating geometric shapes, held together by a shimmering field of blue energy. It didn't possess a face or a body in the traditional sense, but its presence was undeniable. This was the curator, the sentient interface of the synapse. It didn't speak in thoughts like the spire had. Instead, it manipulated the light in the room to create complex three-dimensional maps of the surrounding sectors, showing the movement of the hunters and the encroaching darkness they represented. The curator revealed that the hunters were merely the scouts for a much larger entity, a collective intelligence known as the Void Engine. The Void Engine did not seek to use the lattice. It sought to consume it, to feed its own entropic hunger by breaking down the structures that kept the universe organized. If the synapse fell, the entire sector would collapse into a localized singularity, a black hole that would eventually grow to consume the neighboring systems. The Vespa 9 was needed to deliver a specific harmonic frequency to the core of the synapse, a reset that would reinforce the lattice's integrity and drive back the entropic influence of the Void Engine. But the frequency could only be generated by the kinetic ore they carried, which required the ore to be physically integrated into the station's core. The process would be permanent. Once the ore was integrated, the Vespa 9 would lose its primary power source and its connection to the lattice. Kalen and Vaxon would be stranded on the synapse, their ship a hollow shell. It was a sacrifice that the curator presented as a logical necessity, a simple equation of the greater good versus the individual survival of two men. Kalen looked at Vaxon, who was staring at the ship they had lived on for years. The Vespa 9 was more than a vessel. It was their home, their only link to the lives they had once known. To give up the ore was to give up their freedom, to become permanent residents of an alien tomb in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. "There's another way," Vaxon said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. He pointed to the scavenger ships outside, still visible through the transparent floor. "They have the mass and the engines. If we can link their power cores together and use the Vespa 9 as a conductor, we can generate the frequency without losing the ore. We'd be using their desperation as a fuel source." Kalen considered the idea. It was risky and required the cooperation of people who had just been trying to kill them. But it was the only way to save the ship and potentially recruit allies in the coming conflict. He looked at the curator, the floating geometric shapes shifting in a pattern that suggested calculation. After a long pause, the construct bowed, the blue energy around it pulsing in agreement. Kalen returned to the bridge and released the dampening field. He contacted the scavenger flagship again, this time offering a deal. He would share the secrets of the synapse, enough to allow them to thrive in this sector, in exchange for their help in reinforcing the lattice. The scavengers, having seen the power of the Vespa 9 and the scale of the station, had no choice but to agree. They began the complex process of slaving their engines to the Vespa 9's central computer, a patchwork of technology that felt like trying to build a bridge out of spider silk and iron. But as the engines began to hum in unison, the lattice responded. A massive beam of harmonic energy erupted from the Vespa 9, striking the core of the synapse and sending a ripple of golden light through the entire system. The darkness of the void engine retreated, its influence pushed back to the edges of the void, and for the first time in eons, the synapse was fully awake. The integration of the scavenger fleet's disparate power signatures created a symphony of mechanical stress that threatened to pull the Vespa 9 apart at its primary rivets. Kalen sat at the center of this technological storm, his neural interface flooded with the jagged, unrefined energy of the nomadic ships. It was like trying to filter a tidal wave through a needle. The golden ripple that had surged through the synapse began to solidify into a permanent shimmering field, a reinforced barrier that acted as a firewall against the encroaching entropy of the void engine. Outside the station, the three suns seemed to flare in unison, their light bending around the new gravitational architecture. The scavengers, terrified yet transfixed, held their positions as their reactors redlined, their ships groaning under the harmonic resonance. Then, with a final, silent pulse that felt like a long-held breath being released, the process completed. The synapse was no longer a dormant relic. It was a functioning bastion, its obsidian surfaces now pulsing with a steady, rhythmic violet light that mirrored the hull of Kalen's ship. The curator, that shifting assembly of blue energy and geometry, drifted toward the center of the docking bay as Kalen and Vaxon stepped off the boarding ramp. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, sweet musk of the station's recycled atmosphere. The construct's form became more fluid, its segments spinning with a speed that made it appear as a blurred sphere of light. It projected a new map into the center of the room, one that extended far beyond the local sector. It showed a network of connections stretching toward the very center of the galaxy, a hidden highway of energy that had been severed for millennia. One node, however, burned with a dark, guttering red. It was the prime anchor, the heart of the Kinetic Lattice, and it was currently under siege by the primary mass of the void engine. If the prime anchor fell, the reinforcements they had just established at the synapse would be meaningless. The entire network would collapse from the center outward. Vaxon wiped a smear of grease from his cheek, his expression hardening as he studied the map. He pointed to the red node, noting that the distance was vast, even for a ship bonded to the lattice. They would have to traverse the dead zones, regions of space, where the laws of physics were so decayed that even light struggled to maintain a constant velocity. The scavengers, having fulfilled their part of the bargain, began to detach their umbilicals, their ships limping back toward the safety of the debris fields. They had been given enough data to survive, but they were not warriors, and Kalen knew he couldn't ask them to follow him into the maw of the engine. He watched them go, a small part of him envying their simple struggle for survival. He and Vaxon were now bound to a higher, more demanding destiny, one that offered no guarantee of a return to the quiet life they had once envisioned. Before they could depart, the curator reached out a limb of pure light, touching the hull of the Vespa 9. The ship shivered, its violet skin deepening into a matte black that seemed to absorb all ambient light. The kinetic ore in the hold was reorganized on a molecular level, its density increasing until it became a singularity of potential energy. This was the final upgrade, a gift from the synapse to its guardians. The ship was no longer just a vessel, it was a physical manifestation of the lattice's intent. The internal cabin expanded, the walls becoming translucent displays that showed the curvature of spacetime around them. Kalen felt the ship's consciousness merge even deeper with his own, until he could feel the orientation of every bolt and the flow of every electron. He was the ship, and the ship was the weapon the universe had forged to defend itself. The journey to the prime anchor began with a transition that felt like falling through a mirror. The Vespa 9 didn't just jump, it slipped between the layers of reality, moving through the between, a realm of shifting colors and non-Euclidean geometry. Here, time was not a linear progression, but a landscape they could navigate. Kalen saw flashes of the past and potential futures, the rise of the first terrestrial colonies, the construction of the spires, and a vision of a galaxy consumed by a cold, silent grayness. He held onto his sense of self with a desperate grip, using Vaxon's steady presence as an anchor. Vaxon was occupied with the new tactical systems, calibrating the kinetic pulse to operate at a frequency that could disrupt the Void Engine's entropic fields. They were moving at a speed that defied measurement, a streak of shadow through a world of light. They emerged from the between in the shadow of a supermassive black hole at the galactic core. The prime anchor was there, a colossal ring of white alloy that encircled the event horizon, held in place by a precarious balance of centrifugal force and lattice energy. It was beautiful and terrifying, a monument to a civilization that had played with the fundamental forces of the cosmos as if they were toys. But the ring was being smothered. A swarm of Void Engine entities, massive, shapeless clouds of antimatter and dark energy, were clinging to the ring's surface, their presence eroding the white alloy into a dull, pitted gray. The light of the accretion disk was being drained, pulled into the dark maws of the entities. The Vespa 9 appeared in the midst of this devastation, its black hull invisible against the backdrop of the singularity. Kalen didn't wait for an opening, he created one. He unleashed the kinetic pulse, not as a wave, but as a focused blade of gravitational force. It sliced through the nearest entropic cloud, causing it to dissipate into a shower of harmless photons. The Void Engine reacted instantly, the entities turning away from the ring to focus on the new intruder. They moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, appearing to teleport short distances as they bypassed the normal constraints of space. Kalen pushed the ship into a high G turn, the inertia stabilizers humming as they worked to protect his physical body from the crushing forces of the maneuver. He felt every hit against the shields as a dull ache in his chest, the energy feedback rattling his teeth. This was no longer a tactical engagement, it was a brawl at the edge of eternity. Vaxon was a blur of motion, his hands dancing across the tactical console as he managed the ship's offensive systems. He launched a series of resonance torpedoes, probes that didn't explode, but instead emitted a high-frequency vibration that neutralized the entropic fields of the entities. As the clouds were thinned, the true scale of the Void Engine became visible. At the center of the swarm was a core, a jagged crystalline structure that acted as the brain of the collective. It was pulsing with a sickly, rhythmic light, drawing power directly from the black hole's event horizon. Kalen knew that as long as that core remained intact, the entities would continue to reform. They had to strike at the heart, but the core was protected by a localized distortion field that warped any projectile or beam they threw at it. "We have to go inside," Kalen said, his voice sounding thin even to his own ears. He didn't mean inside the core, but inside the distortion field itself. It was a suicide mission by any standard metric of navigation. The gravitational shear would be enough to tear a planet apart. But the Vespa 9 was infused with the lattice, and Kalen could feel a path, a narrow, twisting corridor of stability through the chaos. He shared the vision with Vaxon, who didn't hesitate. Vaxon rerouted all remaining power to the forward shields and the kinetic drill, the same tool they had used in the beginning to extract ore, now repurposed as a weapon of ultimate penetration. They dove into the heart of the storm, the ship screaming as the distortion field clawed at the hull. The interior of the distortion field was a kaleidoscope of madness. Reality was being unmade and remade every microsecond. Kalen fought to keep the ship on its path, his vision blurring as his brain struggled to process the sensory input. He saw Vaxon's face, pale and determined, illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. They were inches away from the crystalline core when the void engine launched its final defense, a wave of pure entropy that threatened to dissolve the ship's very atoms. Kalen reached out, not with his hands, but with his mind, tapping into the full potential of the kinetic lattice. He didn't just fire a weapon, he became a conduit for the collective will of the galaxy. A beam of white-hot light erupted from the Vesper 9, striking the crystalline core with the force of a collapsing star. The core shattered, and for a moment, the universe went silent. The destruction of the void engine's core did not result in a standard explosion, for there was no atmosphere to carry a shockwave and no simple chemical reaction to fuel a fire. Instead, it was a systemic collapse of local causality. The jagged crystalline structure simply ceased to be, dissolving into a spray of monochromatic sparks that were instantly inhaled by the ravenous gravity of the supermassive black hole. For Kalen, the sensation was that of a sudden, agonizing lightness, as if the heavy hand that had been pressing him into his seat for an eternity had been abruptly lifted. The Vesper 9 drifted in the aftermath, its matte black hull scorched and weeping ribbons of ionized gas from a dozen structural fractures. The translucent displays on the bridge were dead, replaced by a flickering, ghostly static that hummed with the residual echoes of the lattice's final discharge. Beside him, Vaxon sat perfectly still, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in slow, rhythmic intervals. They were alive, but they were empty, two vessels drained of the extraordinary power they had briefly channeled to save the prime anchor. Below them, the great white ring of the anchor began to heal. The grey, pitted surfaces where the entropic entities had clung were being overtaken by a self-replicating silver sheen. The ancient machines within the ring, sensing the removal of the parasitic load, roared back to life, projecting a visible web of golden light across the event horizon. This was the lattice in its purest form, a containment field that kept the singularity from expanding and ensured the steady flow of energy through the galactic nodes. Kalen watched as the light reached out toward the Vesper 9, not to destroy it, but to stabilize it. A tractor beam of soft, amber radiance locked onto their hull, drawing the battered ship toward a docking bay on the inner curve of the ring. They had no thrusters left to resist, no fuel to flee. They could only watch as the gargantuan architecture of the precursors swallowed them into its silent, sterile embrace. The interior of the prime anchor was a cathedral of mathematics. The docking bay was so vast that the Vesper 9 seemed like a speck of dust on a vast, polished floor of translucent ceramic. There were no atmosphere scrubbers here, no jasmine-scented air. The environment was one of absolute purity, a vacuum maintained by fields that allowed the two men to breathe without the need for their heavy suits. As Kalen stepped out of the airlock, he felt a profound sense of displacement. The ground beneath his feet did not feel like solid matter. It felt like a solidified thought, firm yet vibrating with a frequency that made his teeth ache. Vaxon followed him, his movements stiff and cautious, his hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm that he no longer possessed. They were standing at the center of the galaxy, at the very heart of the machine that kept the stars in their orbits, and they felt smaller than they ever had in the deepest minds of the moons. A tall, slender pillar of light rose from the floor in front of them, coalescing into a form that was vaguely humanoid but lacked any defining features. It was a projection of the prime anchor's central intelligence, a consciousness far more vast and ancient than the curator they had encountered at the synapse. It did not speak in thoughts or images, but in a series of harmonic vibrations that resonated directly within their DNA. The message was clear. The cycle had been preserved, but the guardians were spent. The kinetic ore they had carried was gone, consumed in the final strike against the void engine. The Vesper 9 was a husk, its unique bond with the lattice severed by the sheer intensity of the conflict. They had performed their function, and in the cold, logical eyes of the prime anchor, they were now redundant components in a system that had reset itself to a state of equilibrium. The intelligence offered them a final choice, a reward for their service that felt more like a sentence of exile. They could be placed into a state of temporal stasis, preserved within the anchor until the next great cycle required their presence, a period of time that might span tens of thousands of years. Or they could be returned to the fringes of the terrestrial colonies, their memories of the lattice and the precursors suppressed to prevent the knowledge from falling into the hands of those who would seek to repeat the hunter's mistakes. To stay was to become an eternal relic of a machine. To leave was to return to a life of insignificance, forever carrying a hollow space in their souls where the light of the universe had once burned. Kalen looked at Vaxon, seeing the weariness in the older man's eyes. They had seen the beginning and the end of all things. How could they ever go back to hauling ore and drinking recycled water in a colony bar? "We didn't do this for a reward," Vaxon said, his voice raspy but firm. He looked up at the towering pillar of light, his gaze unyielding. "We did it because it had to be done. If the galaxy is safe, then our job is over, but we aren't parts of your machine." "We are men," Kalen nodded, feeling a surge of pride in his companion. They had been used as tools by forces they couldn't comprehend, but they still possessed the one thing the precursor machines lacked, the will to choose their own path, however small and unremarkable it might be. They declined the stasis, and they declined the suppression of their memories. They demanded the right to live with what they knew, to carry the burden of the truth as the final price of their journey. The pillar of light pulsed with a color that Kalen could only describe as a deep, thoughtful indigo, as if the anchor were calculating the variables of human defiance. The transition back to the periphery was a blur of silver and shadow. They were not sent back in the Vesper 9, which remained in the anchor as a monument to the Guardians, but in a small, automated transport that looked like a smooth river stone. When Kalen finally opened his eyes, he was staring at a sky of familiar, dusty red. They were on the surface of an outer rim moon, not far from the mining colonies where their journey had begun. The transport had vanished, leaving them sitting in the metallic dust with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a small, glowing shard of kinetic glass, a fragment of the ore that had survived the final battle. It was a cold, lonely place, and the distant lights of the colony domes looked like tiny, fragile sparks against the encroaching dark of the void. They walked toward the colony in silence, their boots crunching on the silicon ground. The weight of the atmosphere felt heavy, the air tasting of stale oxygen and industrial grease. When they reached the airlock of the main settlement, the guards barely looked at them, seeing only two more weary prospectors returning from a failed haul. There were no celebrations, no songs of their victory, no recognition of the fact that the very stars above were still burning because of what they had done. They found a small, cramped room in the lower levels of the hab block, a space that smelled of damp metal and ancient dust. Kalen sat on the edge of a narrow bunk, holding the shard of kinetic glass in his hand. It pulsed with a faint, dying light, a reminder of the lattice that was now far beyond his reach. As the weeks turned into months, Kalen and Vaxon blended into the rhythm of the colony. They took jobs in the maintenance tunnels, fixing the same kinds of broken relays and leaking pipes they had once repaired on the Vesper 9. They rarely spoke of the spire, the synapse, or the prime anchor, but sometimes, when the shift was over and the colony lights dimmed for the night cycle, they would stand on the observation deck and look toward the galactic core. They knew that somewhere out there, hidden behind the curtains of gold and violet light, the great machines were still turning, the silver rings were still spinning, and the balance was being maintained. They were the only ones who knew that the peace of the galaxy was bought with a price, and that the darkness was always waiting just beyond the edge of the light. The shard of glass eventually went dark, its energy finally fading into the background radiation of the moon. Kalen kept it in his pocket, a smooth, weightless stone that served as his only anchor to a reality that felt more like a dream with each passing year. He knew that one day, perhaps long after he and Vaxen were gone, the Void Engine or something like it would return, and the Lattice would call for new guardians to rise from the ranks of the desperate and the brave. But for now, he was content to be a man in the dark, watching the stars and knowing that, for one brief, brilliant moment, he had been the needle that held the universe together. He closed his eyes and listened to the low-frequency vibration of the colony's life support, a sound so much like the hull of a ship, and he finally felt at peace.